Now, the title of the general session is Short-Termism, but because this is a general corporate governance conference, what I'd like to do is to link short-termism to other corporate governance mechanisms more generally. So I'd like to talk about executive compensation to begin with. This is something which has been linked to short-termism, but also to other problems such as excessive risk-taking. Then after that, I'm going to talk about the short-termism of shareholders. And here I'm actually going to take a slightly different line from Patrick and actually from the Kay report, which is a little bit foolhardy because John Kay was the Dean of Oxford's Business School when I was an undergraduate there about 3 years ago. So what I'm going to argue is in contrast to them, actually short-termism of shareholders can be desirable to lead to long-term outcomes in terms of long-term firm behaviour in certain circumstances with that important qualification. And finally, if I have time, I'll talk about short-termism in terms of disclosure policy, how accounting can be a contributing factor. Yeah, but I'd like to start by first talking about short-termism in terms of executive compensation and also the compensation debate more generally. So this has been a highly controversial topic. So it's been seen to be a cause of short-termism and also many other problems. So the debate goes as follows. So in theory, how should executive compensation be set? In an ideal world, you have shareholders. Shareholders appoint a board of directors, and this board of directors decides the compensation contract to be the best for shareholders. So what does this mean? You offer a good package to attract a talented CEO, but you don't pay over the odds for that CEO. And also you give the CEO good incentives to act in interest of shareholders and potentially also other stakeholders as well. But that's only in theory, that's only in an ideal world. Well, what happens in practice? Well, in some circumstances, what may happen is that it's the CEO who appoints the board of directors. So the CEO can put his or her friends on the board and then try to pay himself or herself as much as possible, perhaps engage in what's known as stealth compensation, which is where you pay yourself in ways that are hidden from shareholders, such as retirement benefits or company perks, and you're doing this to maximize your salary. And while this may seem to be a little bit of a caricature, there is some evidence that this is what's going on in practice. So if you were to look at some of just the numbers, the actual high levels of pay seem to be out of whack with other employees, and also CEOs get paid apparently for failure. So when a CEO gets fired, he or she can get a large golden parachute, so tens of millions of dollars for driving the company into the ground. And so this, not surprisingly, has led to a number of calls for regulation of executive compensation. We've seen this in, say, Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley, and we've seen regulations to try to cure this potential problem. But I see that the role of a regulator as being similar to a role of a doctor. So just like a doctor will take the Hippocratic Oath, which is first, do no harm. What does that mean? You have to recognize that before doing a surgical intervention, you need to be careful that the cure is not actually worse than the disease. So if you have an injury to your leg, maybe physical therapy is better than amputating it. And similarly here, what people argue is a concern with regulation is that some of the recent regulations may actually throw out the baby with the bathwater. They may do more harm than good. They may stifle business. And so this is where people like myself and Patrick hope to contribute to this debate, because you may wonder, why do academics have a stake in this? Shouldn't you listen to, say, compensation consultants or activist shareholders? So they're clearly closer to the action than Patrick or I are. But while they focus on, say, a small subset of companies, which are the companies that they have shares in and maybe other companies that they're monitoring, before we decide on policy, what we'd like to see is, well, what's happening to companies in general? Because you'd like policy not to be driven by a couple of anecdotal, albeit high-profile examples. So what we can do is we can study hundreds and hundreds of companies at different points in time and potentially in different countries to see whether these high-profile examples that we see in the media are generally true. Is this just a few bad apples, or is the entire cart rotten? Because obviously the media and other commentators will tend to talk about the cases in which compensation is broken, because that's more interesting. Just like you're not going to report in the news that the Halfpenny Bridge failed to collapse today, you're going to report things which don't work, and this may be why the media's got much more attention in terms of the cases that don't work, when there may be some cases that do. Okay, so I'm going to first start by looking at the theory and the evidence in terms of one feature of compensation, which is the level of pay. So I'm not talking about short-term versus long-term yet. That will come in a later slide. But even if we just focus on the level of pay, this seems to be something which is strongly in favour of this idea that compensation is broken and it needs to be fixed. So if you just look at some numbers, in the US, the number 250 CEO in 2008 earned $9 million. This is a substantial amount of money. This went up sixfold since 1980, and it's also 300 times what a rank-and-file employee earns. This seems outrageous. Right? A CEO may be talented, but it's not worth 300 times what an average worker is worth. And this is why many commentators, and this view has been most prominently espoused by Bebchuk and Fried, argue that CEO pay is not set by boards on behalf of shareholders, but it's set by CEOs themselves who engage in what they call rent extraction. They want to try to steal or extract as much as they can from the company. But that is only one view. There is another view, and the other view is that actually CEO pay in general is efficient. It's driven by competitive market forces. So one piece of evidence is that pay has actually fallen 40% since the peak. So this is why it's sort of dangerous just to look at a few anecdotal data points. Looking at many companies in general over different time periods may be more informative in terms of policymakers. But you might say, well, even if you take 40% off $9 million, that is still a huge amount of money. So this is still in favour of the rent extraction argument. And so you might think, well, why do CEOs get paid so much more? So one argument is, well, CEOs are talented compared to the average worker. But again, this argument doesn't seem to make sense, right? Because if CEOs are very talented, they should have been paid a lot of money in 1980, not just in 2008. CEOs haven't just become talented, more talented over the last 30 years. So the fact that this has been a recent phenomenon suggests that it's not driven by efficiency. However, there is an argument which can explain talent as the source of high pay. So the argument is as follows. CEOs haven't become more talented over time, but talent has become more important. Again, CEOs have not become more talented over time, but talent has become more important. To explain this argument, I'd like to go to the example of Irish football. So let's compare Robbie Keane, who, for those who don't follow it, is one of the Irish national players today, and compare him with Johnny Giles, who played for Ireland in the 60s and 70s. He played for Leeds United. So if you were to take Robbie Keane and Johnny Giles, both of them are as talented as each other, or people might argue that Johnny Giles is more talented. However, who gets paid more? Robbie Keane gets paid far more than Johnny Giles ever got paid, even when controlling for things such as inflation. Why is this? Well, it's because the stakes are much higher nowadays. Talent has become more important. Football is now a much bigger business. So when Robbie Keane plays for Tottenham Hotspur or LA Galaxy, these companies can derive revenues all throughout the world. They can have replicant shirt merchandise, they can derive from the internet business, and so forth. So it's really worth paying top dollar for top talent. Even though you or I, if we went down to a training session, we might not be able to tell the difference looking at Robbie Keane play compared to the next best midfielder. These tiny differences in talent could lead to Tottenham Hotspur qualifying for the Champions League or not qualifying. And because the stakes are so big, it is worthwhile paying top dollar for top talent. Now, move away from football and move to general corporations. How does the argument go? Well, this talent has become more important because firms have become so much bigger over the past 30 years. Now we have international competition, and now indeed firms have risen sixfold since the 1980s. So the rise in firm size has actually been coincidental with the rise in CEO pay. So now the average firm size in the top 500 in the US is $10 billion. So let's say we also don't believe that CEO talent is that much different. Let's say the best CEO only adds 1% more of firm value compared to the next best CEO. But 1%, when you apply this to $10 billion of firm size, that is $100 million. That's a substantial amount of money, and therefore it can be worthwhile paying top dollar for top talent because the stakes are so high nowadays. So the argument goes that you don't want to compare the CEO pay to the average worker pay. Just like you would never compare Robbie Keane to, say, an administrator of the football club. You'd want to compare the CEO's pay to how much he or she brings into the company. Now, obviously, that argument only holds water if it's predicated on the idea that CEOs do actually add value to begin with. And you may be able to cite many high-profile examples of CEOs destroying a lot of value. And while people are happy to see footballers earning a lot of money or movie stars because they can see their talent, the caricature is that CEOs may just fly around in a corporate jet and play a few rounds of golf. But this is nothing more than a caricature. So in many cases, you think, well, what value did, say, Steve Jobs add to Apple? Or if we think of Ireland, someone like Sir Tony O'Reilly, they can add substantial amounts of value to shareholders, but also to society in general. So when we look at the evidence in general, what it does seem to be is that there are a few bad apples, but the entire cart is not rotten, so it's not necessarily the case that we should rush to regulate. The problem is not general, but there are a few specific cases. But we should care about these few specific cases, right? The fact that other companies don't suffer, that's not much of a consolation if you are the employee of a company or a shareholder of a company which has gone bust. So we still should care about the examples of CEOs being paid for failure. The question is what to do about this. So one solution is regulation, but there are a couple of problems with regulation. So one issue is that regulation tends to be one size fits all. In the US, for example, there's an argument that CEOs should not get paid more than, say, the president, which is $400,000 a year. Now, $400,000 a year may be ample for CEOs of certain companies, but may not be optimal in other circumstances. So would certain CEOs, say Steve Jobs, have been motivated to work so hard? Were his pay capped at $400,000? Potentially the answer is no. A second issue is that regulations can be circumvented. So the Clinton administration introduced a $1 million cap on salaries for them to be tax deductible in order to try to limit pay. So what did companies do in response? Well, if the company wanted to pay $3 million, they paid the CEO the $1 million salary and paid the CEO also a $2 million bonus, but said, well, this is a guaranteed bonus. We're going to give this to you irrespective of future performance. So it functioned like a salary, and it got round this cap on $1 million of actual salary. And this is actually a bad outcome, right? Because you want bonuses to be given based on performance, and this regulation drove bonuses to be uncontingent upon performance. So regulation is not an issue. What is the optimal solution? So what I believe is that shareholders and boards should have a greater say in the pay-setting process, because it's shareholders who are the ultimate owners of companies, and they suffer if the CEO is under-incentivized or overpaid. So we can do a couple of things to help them. So number one is we can give shareholders a voice. We can give them a voice in the pay-setting process. They can influence the pay packages that are given. And so under Dodd-Frank, we have the say on pay legislation. Shareholders can vote according to whether they believe the pay package should be approved or not. The vote is non-binding, it is advisory, but it is still something which is helpful and can constrain pay. The second thing that we can do is we can give shareholders not just the voice, but also the information in order to guide their voting decisions by greater disclosure on how much CEOs are getting paid. So this idea of stealth compensation that I referred to on the very first slide, of CEOs extracting pay through underhand ways or not transparent ways such as retirement benefits, this is also something which is changing. So in 2006, the Securities and Exchange Commission changed the regulations, forcing greater transparency. And this allows the shareholders to see, well, in this case, is such a large retirement benefit justified or isn't, and they can vote accordingly. Okay, so now maybe the last couple of slides may have given the impression that, well, I'm in an academic ivory tower if I think that things are all right in the real world and we shouldn't really change too much. However, I'd like to now give the other side of the debate adequate airtime and argue that there are certain elements of compensation that could be improved on. And one element is this idea that compensation sometimes leads to excessive risk-taking. Why is this? It's because in many companies, CEOs are only paid in terms of equity-like securities, such as shares and options. And this can give them incentives to take a lot of risk. Why? Shareholders are protected by limited liability. So if a company goes bankrupt, it's bondholders who carry the can and who suffer, which is why there had to be bailouts of financial institutions. Whereas if the risk pays off, equity holders are the residual claimant and get the upside. So if the CEO is aligned only with shareholders because she owns just equity, and not aligned with debt holders because she doesn't hold any debt, then she may have incentives to take excessive risk. So one of the early papers I wrote with Chi Liu, this is published in the Review of Finance, which is the European Finance Association's journal, argued that the optimal compensation scheme involves giving the manager both debt and equity in her firm. And this is something which is actually implemented in practice in some firms. So Raghu Sundaram and David Yermak of NYU Stern found that CEOs hold substantial amounts of debt in some circumstances in the form of defined benefit pensions and deferred compensation. Why do I call these debt? Because the payoff in bankruptcy is very similar to debt. If the firm goes bankrupt and creditors recover only 40 cents per dollar, a holder of an unsecured defined benefit pension also recovers the same amount per dollar. And Patrick has a paper related to this where he argues that you should tie compensation to the credit default swap spread of a company. And again, this is very sensible. This makes sure that the CEO cares about bondholders and makes sure that he doesn't take excessive risk at the expense of them. And recently, the European Union's Liikanen Commission, which had a number of proposals for reform, one of them was to recommend debt-based pay in order to make sure that CEOs don't take excessive risk. The final component of compensation that I'll talk to before going to the other components of governance is indeed short-termism, which is the title of the session. So another problem with compensation is often CEOs care about incentives, but incentives only for the short term. Because if they're given, say, stock and options with a 1-year or 2-year vesting period, they only care about what happens over the next 1 or 2 years. And so this can lead to a lot of problems. So in the financial crisis, this may give you incentives to write some subprime loans to boost your immediate income. Okay, maybe these subprime loans become delinquent 5 years later, but if you can sell your shares within 1 or 2 years, you don't really mind if the stock price tanks after 5 years. And indeed, Angelo Mazzillo, who was the former CEO of Countrywide, he was shown to have sold $129 million of stock in the 12 months before the onset of the financial crisis. And this is not just one example. There are other more systematic studies showing that short-term compensation was at least correlated with a bad behavior in terms of CEOs taking some bad actions. And it's not just about CEOs taking bad actions, but it's also about you want to encourage CEOs to take good actions. So if you want the CEO to invest for the long-term health of the company, it is necessary to give the CEO a stake in the firm's long-term financial health. So Patrick presented a paper by Eccles et al. Where they looked at some ESG investment and showed that this doesn't show up in the stock price until many years from now. So if a CEO only cares about the next year's stock price, she may be worried about such investment being costly in the short term and not focusing on the long-run benefits. And this is something that I also looked at in one of my papers here, where I looked at investment in employee satisfaction, another intangible, like the intangible studied in this ESG paper. So what I looked at is the list of the Fortune magazine's 100 best companies to work for in America. Similar lists appear in other countries as well. And so I looked at a very simple strategy of buying the companies on this list, controlling for risk and other factors. So if the market was efficient, which was one of the hypotheses that Patrick was looking at, then what would happen is that as soon as companies were published in this list, the stock price should go up immediately, and there should be no long-run outperformance. Right? This is highly public information. This should immediately go into the stock price. However, my conclusions were exactly the same as Patrick's. What I found is that even if you bought these companies after they had entered the list, you would still earn superior returns, and these superior returns were enjoyed for up to 4 to 5 years after the initial list publication. For some reason, it takes 4 to 5 years for this information to get into the stock price. And it's puzzling why this is, but one potential reason is before my current life of poverty, I used to work for Morgan Stanley. And at Morgan Stanley, we would value companies with an Excel spreadsheet. So we could put things such as companies' profits and tangible assets into the spreadsheet. Something such as environmental responsibility, or corporate culture, or employee satisfaction, these are clearly value relevant, but you don't know how to put them into an Excel spreadsheet. And so a manager who cares about the short term may cater to investors who only value based on these things and may underinvest. So what is the solution? Well, the solution is not too complicated. So the solution is potentially just to increase the vesting period of stock and options. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through everything on this slide, but I just want to focus on this point here. Give CEOs shares and options which vest over a long period, perhaps, say, 5 years or so. And this will give the CEO a 5-year horizon and not take these short-term bad actions, and also take long-term good actions. Now, there has been another solution proposed to this, which is known as clawback. So the idea here is you give the CEO a bonus, and if performance afterwards turns out to be bad, you claw back the bonus. Now, this is something similar in spirit to tying up CEO stock for a long period of time, but it's more akin to, I believe, shutting the barn door after the horse has bolted. The problem with this is that once you've paid out the bonus, the legality of clawing it back afterwards is sometimes questionable, because it may well be that CEO spent the money or given the money to a relative, and so it's much harder to claw it back afterwards. It seems an easier solution is just not to pay out the money to begin with, right? You just lock up the CEO shares and options for a long period to make sure that the CEO cares about the future. Okay, so now what I'd like to link this to is shareholders. And what I said earlier on one of the early slides is that we should not regulate, but we should give shareholders a say in pay setting so that they can set the pay scheme to be one which is going to maximise the long-term health of the company. So under this view, it is quite tempting to think that only long-term shareholders will implement a long-term pay scheme. And this is behind a number of the sensible proposals which have been suggested, such as in the K report and such as with loyalty shares. And we've had calls for transactions taxes or short sales restrictions. The idea you want to lock in investors because investors who are going to be around for 5 years will care about how the company does in 5 years' time. It's very intuitive. And indeed, in the 1980s, we advocated the Japanese model, where shareholders were indeed locked in and had larger stakes, and this was argued to be a cause of Japanese superior economic performance in the 1980s. However, I'd like to present a slightly different view, and this view is consistent with the fact that actually the Japanese model hasn't turned out to be the paradigm that everybody thought it would be. So the last 30 years since then, it hasn't performed as strongly. Obviously, this would be for many reasons other than the horizon of shareholders, but this is at least consistent with the view that maybe short-term shareholders may not, in all circumstances, be as bad as they might otherwise seem. So my argument is that the main distinction that we want to make is not between short-term and long-term shareholders, but between large and small shareholders. So the important question is not whether shareholders are short-term or long-term, but between whether shareholders are large or small. So it is indeed true if shareholders are short-term and also small, this can lead to problems. Why? If a shareholder is very small, they don't have incentives to gather difficult information, such as the ESG information that Patrick was talking about. Why? This information is not easily available. What information is easily available? A company's earnings. You can look at a company's profits very easily. So if shareholders only have small skin in the game, they're just going to be looking at earnings, and this is going to give managers incentives to boost earnings by cutting investment or by writing some bad subprime loans. However, in contrast, if you have shareholders which have a large stake, they have sufficient skin in the game to gather this other value-relevant information. So to go back to the footballing example that I had earlier, this is the difference between buying a player based on their statistics, how many goals did they score, or how many tackles did they win, versus actually scouting the player and watching the player actually play. So back to a corporate context, what does this mean? So if you think of some investors with large stakes, these are examples such as Warren Buffett or Bill Miller of the Legg Mason Value Fund or Alistair Ross-Scooby of the Hermes Focus Fund. What did they do? Rather than having, say, 200 companies, they owned a portfolio of a few companies and really got to understand the company. So if a company had, say, the dividend cut that Patrick was referring to, rather than immediately selling their shares, which is what a small investor would do, they would try to understand, well, what are the reasons for this dividend cut? Are the reasons why they cut the dividend because they are financing an investment in the long-run health of the company? If they indeed found this, then they could hold on to the company rather than selling. But if, on the other hand, the dividend cut was caused by, say, managerial incompetence, let's say the manager wasted a lot of money, earnings are low, and therefore dividends have to drop, what would the shareholders do? Well, they could sell in the short term. And this short-term selling, which Patrick referred to as exit, can actually be a helpful governance mechanism in some circumstances. If the company has some problems like low earnings, because the manager has underperformed, you do want to allow shareholders to sell in those circumstances because this is going to be disciplining the manager. So exit, in contrast to the common view that exit and selling your shares is the antithesis of governance, this in many cases can actually be an act of governance. You can govern companies through voting with your feet or otherwise engaging in the Wall Street rule, so getting out of a firm which is underperforming. So in an ideal world, if a company wanted to implement, say, better environmental protection or better workforce diversity or better employee treatment, what they could try to do is engage in voice. They could try to get a seat on the board or win a proxy fight. But these mechanisms are notoriously very difficult to win. So another solution that you can have is if the company is not investing in the long-term health of the firm by polluting the environment and mistreating employees, you'd like to allow shareholders the chance to sell their shares. And the concern is that if you lock them up for 3 years through giving them some loyalty shares or by putting on some transaction taxes, then if the manager underperforms by shirking on these long-term responsibilities, then the shareholders may just let the manager get away with it rather than selling their shares because they want to have these benefits of potentially being a long-term owner. So what my argument is that conditional long-termism is better than unconditional loyalty. If shareholders have the option to sell in the short term, this keeps the manager on his or her toes. What is critical is that the shareholder not only has the option to sell in the short term, but also has a large enough stake. So any selling versus non-selling decision is driven by information that they've gathered on the ESG performance of the company or on the fundamental health of the company, and not short-term dividends and earnings. But if they do have this information, then you actually do want them to have the option to sell in the short term. What is the evidence for this? Well, we can look at the effect of changes in stock liquidity, which is the ability with which shareholders can buy or sell shares, and look at whether this improves firm value or not. And so this paper here looks at exogenous shocks to liquidity caused by regulation and finds that liquidity improves firm value. And it improves firm value particularly in firms which have high block holders. Why? Well, their argument is that it allows these block holders a greater threat. They can threaten to sell the shares if the manager starts shirking or failing to invest in the long-run health of the company. And a recent paper that I wrote found that liquidity is also useful for block holders to form in the first place. By making it easier to buy or sell shares, it's easier to form a large stake to begin with and therefore have enough skin in the game to monitor the company. I was going to talk about disclosure, but in the interest of time, I know that we started a little bit late. I'm going to skip this, and I look forward to the panel's reaction and to your comments. But thank you very much for your attention.